יש לנו את הזכות לקיים כאן את הדיון המאוד מאוד מיוחד הזה, עם אלג'יר הוקינס, פעיל מתנועת האחות שלנו, אלטרנטיבה סוציאליסטית בארצות הברית, ופעיל שנים ארוכות במאבק באלימות משטרתית ובגזענות ובבלק לייבס מטר בניו יורק. ובעצם אלג'יר תכף יציג לנו יותר לעומק במשך סדר גודל של 40-45 דקות את ההשתלשלויות של האירועים ואת ההתפתחות שלהם, ובעצם מה קורה ומה אפשר ללמוד גם לכאן וגם בכלל לתנועות המחאה בתקופה הזאת, ואיך אפשר להגיע להישגים בתקופה כזאת נגד הגזענות, האלימות המשטרתית, העוני. אבל חשוב להגיד שאנחנו מקיימים את הדיון הזה אחרי שראינו במאי האחרון עוד רצח מזעזע של ג'ורג' פלויד על ידי שוטר בארצות הברית, ובעצם בשיאה של מגפה ראינו תנועה המונית מתפרצת, את הבלק לייבס מטר קמה מחדש לחיים, ומיליונים, מאות אלפים ברחבי כל העולם יוצאים להפגין למרות ההגבלות, למרות הסגרים שהיו באותה תקופה, ובעצם התפשטות של הסלוגן הזה ושל המאבקים לכל העולם. והחלנו לראות גם הישגים משמעותיים של התנועה הזאת וניצחונות מסוימים, התקדמויות, אבל גם לא מעט אתגרים שניצבים גם עכשיו. אנחנו רק היום ראינו את טראמפ, ברוך השם, יוצא מהבית הלבן, אבל זו שאלה רצינית עם זה שיש עכשיו את קמלה האריס וג'וי ביידן שם, הולך לשנות משהו. אני חושב שזו שאלה משמעותית לדיון הזה, מאוד מאוד אקטואלית, האם האישה האפרו-אמריקאית הראשונה בבית הלבן מייצגת שינוי אמיתי, שורשי, עבור המצב בתקופה הזאת, אם כן, אם לא, אני משוכנע שאלג'יר יוכל לעזור לנו ולהבין את זה. אז אני אסיים כאן ואתן את הבמה באמת ואת הכבוד לאלג'יר לקחת אותנו מכאן.
It's an absolute honor for me to be here with you. I wish I was there with you in person. Certainly we know the circumstances that we have to meet under Zoom conditions. Before I begin with the heart of my contribution, I want to use two quotes that I think really express what took place on May 25th, 2020, following the murder, the public murder of George Floyd. The first quote: when we revolt, is not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. And that's from Frantz Fanon, who wrote, and the book was released after his death in 1961 or 65, Wretched of the Earth. The second quote is from comedian Jon Stewart, who said on June 17th, and I quote, "They're enforcing segregation. Segregation is legally over, but never ended. The police are, in some respects, a border patrol, and they patrol the border between the two Americas. Comrades, sisters, brothers, and family, 2020 and the first few days of 2021 will go down in US and world history as a turning point. The same way 2019 was historic for the intensification of class struggle around the world, the development of counter-revolution, and the overthrow of brutal dictatorships and governments. From Puerto Rico to Hong Kong, to Bolivia, to social explosions around the world that marked 2019 a year of struggle by the working class, the poor, and the oppressed. 2020 will be added to the annals of that history, and so will 2021. as the comrade correctly pointed out, that Joe Biden became the 46th president of the United States. The era of Trump and the presidency is over, but Trumpism is not over by any stretch of the imagination. And I will come back to that in a moment. From COVID-19 that has cost the lives of 400,000 US workers and youth and poor and elderly, has exposed the failures of the for-profit system healthcare that we have in the United States. The great economic recession has brought a deep level of precarity to the lives of working people and the poor. The concerns over rent, the lack of food, and mass unemployment. The George Floyd Rebellion on May 25th, 2020, exposed the total failure of the racist capitalist America to provide any semblance of justice, democracy, or freedom. And I think it's important to contextualize George Floyd as the embodiment of this historical moment within the United States and certainly throughout the world. George Floyd was COVID-19 asymptomatic positive. He was accused of using a $20 bill, a US $20 bill, a counterfeit $20 bill in a grocery store. And as a Black man in America, he was dealing with the three ills of US society: the question of healthcare, the question of economic precarity, and the ever-present character of racial oppression in the United States. Because if all Black lives matter, even within our movement, to tear down the edifice of capitalism and racism, we cannot only talk about George Floyd, we must talk about the Breonna Taylors of the United States, or the Tony McKay of the United States. We must highlight the conditions of Black women and the conditions of the Black LGBTQIA+ community as they face down the violence in our community and the state-sponsored violence. The uprising produced a powerful, multiracial, working class, youth-oriented response to Trump, to COVID-19, and to police violence. It was centered around Black youth. But what the rebellion showed itself is that there's a vacuum of leadership and organization. But even with that said, it produced multiple firings of law enforcement officers, several indictments across the country of killer cops. But you should know this, that there's a 2 to 3% indictment rate of killer cops. So what we are saying is that law enforcement officers can kill with impunity and never face accountability for their actions and for the violence that they put upon the Black working class, the poor, and youth. It is the largest protest movement across the United States and perhaps the world. Every state in the United States had a protest. Every inch of the country, from the rural areas of the country to the urban centers of the country, had an element of the rebellion, saying Black lives matter. The symbols of hate was torn down across the country and the world, a stark reminder that the United States is a racist capitalist society, and that those who had defended slavery and the institutions of slavery should not have monuments in their name, nor flags representing that brutal system of exploitation and subjugation. The Black Lives Matter movement, in its first iteration, from 2014 to 2016, brought about a number of key reforms to policing in the United States. In fact, 24 states enacted reforms that will curtail police violence, one of them being body cameras on law enforcement officers' person. Reforms around biasness and discrimination, procedural efforts to stop the violence in Black and brown communities and to the wider working class. We must remind ourselves that the first Black president who said in 2004, there's no Black America or white America, but there's one America. The first Black president who took office in 2009 said that we are now living in a post-racial society, where it is in fact not the color of your skin that will judge you, but it will be your character. BLM rose to prominence in the face of the Obama years that tore apart the whole concept of the post-racial paradigm. It was thrown in the waste bin of history. The rebellion led to a serious development where the political and economic establishment was in deep crisis. We will come back to this in a moment, but even the events on January 6th, the siege at the Capitol, deserves its own analysis and understanding within this moment as we struggle against racial oppression. But the siege at the Capitol is a continuum of the events of Charlottesville, where Heather Heyer was murdered by a white supremacist. It exposed the Democratic Party that has control over the city governments in a number of states and cities, like Seattle, Washington, where the socialist city councilor Sharma Sawant is located, or in Minneapolis, where the rebellion took place on May 25th. These city governments led by the Democratic Party have put forward austerity budgets and major cuts to public and social services that will benefit the working class, the poor, and the youth, and specifically the Black working class, poor, and youth. The role of police in a society was questioned because of the rebellion. And also their bloated budgets. In the place to where I'm born and raised in New York City, the New York City Police Department's budget annually on a yearly basis is $5.9 billion. Keep that number in your head. That's almost greater than some countries' GDP, in fact. And what they've done, they've taken the war that they will execute globally and bring the war home to the American working class, poor, and youth. We live in a blue wall culture. Every facet of American life is rooted in the idea of law and order. And those involved at the Capitol, the siege of the Capitol, only 14 days ago, were people in law enforcement. In fact, many police unions had endorsed Trump for his 2020 re-election campaign. Law enforcement is an occupying force. It is a caste system, in fact, with their own ways and means in the society, their own language, their own cultural processes. This is in the face of over 40 years of neoliberal capitalism. And in many ways, the ingredients of this blue wall culture is ingrained in the development of American capitalism, and really beginning in the period of slavery and post-slavery. So the movement's demands during the rebellion was on a higher level than during 2014, 2015, and 2016. The demand to defund police, to abolish prisons, to drive out police unions out of the labor movement. It was a major step forward in consciousness, but also programmatic demands that will attempt to chip away at the blue wall culture of the United States. But the question for socialists, for working class activists is this. It's a step forward, but how do you take these demands and bring them to life in the living, breathing struggle against the working class and against capitalism and the ruling class? Certainly, if you do not center your analysis on capitalism and abolishing capitalism, then the demand sounds radical, but also it sounds utopian. Because the institution of the blue wall culture is undergirded by the existence of the 0.1% in society that has all the wealth, the resources, and control of private property underneath their control. And that the police and law enforcement are nothing but the security guards for Jeff Bezos, for Bill and Melinda Gates, and Warren Buffett. So our program, both in Seattle and in Minneapolis, used across the country in varying degrees, is for fighting for reforms with no illusion that capitalism and its institutions will relinquish power. The clarity and specifics of our articulation of a winning program is rooted in understanding the mood, the consciousness, and the fighting capacity of the working class in this movement. Because cutting the police budget in half is important, but being very clear on the specifics about what do we mean around public safety for working people and the poor, and what does restorative justice or transformative justice look like in real life terms. As an example, that when there's an emergency, a non-criminal emergency, we should not have uniformed officers deal with mental health crises as we have in the United States. There should be non-uniform core response teams that moves away from using law enforcement. But in fact, we're using non-uniform workers and healthcare experts and medical staff, where the community, social workers, and the wider public sector have control over to make sure whoever's in distress can get the help that they need. But tragically, in the United States, the police are used to deal with that situation, and 9 out of 10 times, there's a tragedy that happens. And we saw it this past summer with Walter Wallace from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who died from the hands of police, who was going through a mental health crisis. We must tie this to the fact that America is a prison nation where we have 6.5 million people under state supervision. They're either in prison, they're on parole, they're interlocked in the criminal justice system. A key element to the struggle and to the rebellion is that we saw the role of labor. Some of our members in Minneapolis, the heart of where the rebellion ignited, bus drivers from ATU Local 1005 said that we will not transport those arrested to the various jails to be held for questioning. This happened in Minneapolis, and this happened in New York. We saw even in the height of COVID-19, labor organizing taking place among the nurses and the doctors. In Seattle, Washington, the Seattle Police Officers Guild was thrown out of the labor movement in Seattle. In Shama Sawant, the Socialist City Councilor and member of Socialist Alternative, from the very beginning of her years in public office, has raised the banner of BLM. And, for example, voted against the police union's contract. And at the same time, won key demands and reforms to curtail the militarization of the police department in Seattle, Washington. In 2018, we saw the teachers go on strike in a number of cities and states. And one of the demands of the teachers was linking the question of budgetary priorities to making sure communities of color will get the key resources necessary for them to live a dignified life under a period of austerity. And at the same time, we saw demands of unionization take place. What you have, sisters and brothers, family and comrades, is the interconnected character of racial justice and economic justice. And you cannot separate those two if we are about dismantling American capitalism and racism. But as I pointed out, there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum of leadership, and particularly revolutionary leadership. And there's challenges to the Black Lives Matter banner. The first thing I have to say, and I'm gonna come to this point in a moment, the rise of the hard right. And like I said, it deserves special attention, to which I can't do proper justice to at this moment. But I can say one thing, that if there's no political alternative that speaks in the name of the working class and poor, that vacuum will be filled up by forces that is rooted in hate, in subjugation, and in violence. And that the hard right has different features within it. It's not homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous. And so we must understand what it represents. I'll come to that in a moment. But the empire struck back because of the rebellion. And we had an element of what we call woke capitalism some of the richest human beings and corporations gave Black Lives Matter and different racial justice organizations $2 billion. Amazon, Google. We saw symbolic politics taking place. And because our movement is still politically immature, that it left the demands of defund the police in the hands of the two-party system. To be more specific, left it in the hands of the Democratic Party, politicians, independent organizations like non-governmental organizations. And so it left our demands and our movement and our moment of that rebellion for co-optation and attack from the Democratic Party to the Black misleadership class and to the various mayors and governors of a number of states in the country. And we saw performative acts of solidarity from people like Nancy Pelosi, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party. Today, Joe Biden became the 46th president of the United States. His inauguration today, and in the next 10 days, he is preparing executive orders to reverse a number of the more grotesque features of the Trump presidency around climate, around immigration, around healthcare and COVID-19. There's the talk and the discussions around what would be the most expensive stimulus package in US history of $1.9 trillion to deal with the economic crisis. These actions, comrades and friends and family, these actions is meant to reset the capitalist bourgeois democratic order at home and abroad. This is very important to wrap our heads around. It is to stave off greater crisis, but also to deal with the prospects of greater class polarization in the society. But we must keep in mind who Joe Biden is and has been his entire political career. He is from the lineage of the neoliberal model that has dominated Democratic Party politics since the 1970s and taken to a higher level under Bill Clinton in the 1990s and extended by Obama. This crisis is forcing him, and the system is saying we must do something, cut across a more deeper process of crisis, but also of mass explosion. And Joe Biden will have a honeymoon period, but I don't want to say that in a very cavalier way, because his time in office, he still has an economic crisis. He has the question of China and Chinese relations. He has the question of racial oppression, because law enforcement terror will not stop under Joe Biden, let's be clear. And of course, he has COVID-19. His honeymoon period will be very shaky. And I would argue will be day to day, in fact. People are ecstatic that Trump is no longer in power. But in his final speech to the country, Trump announced that he is putting forward an idea of forming a new party called the Patriot Party. As I stated, Trumpism will not be in the White House, but Trumpism is not going away anytime soon. We have to see what this Patriot Party looks like. And we can't speak of a hard right in homogeneous terms. We must speak of them in heterogeneous terms, because there's different elements inside the Republican Party and the hard right that we must grapple with and fully understand. Because you can have figures like Josh Holland, who sounds like Bernie Sanders, but on the right, who can talk about working class people, but also attack immigrants. And there will be a groundswell among the working class, but specifically the deindustrialized white working class. And the left cannot give up on that population. It's vital, actually, that the left must articulate a program and analysis that speaks of why the crisis is taking place in their communities as well, alongside the Black and brown working class and poor. So the events of the siege at the Capitol on January 6th is rooted in the contradiction of American history and mythology. The vacuum of a viable political economic alternative that puts the needs of working people before first than corporate America will lead us to this historical moment in crisis. But added to that, a society that is etched with the lived history of state-sponsored violence, of hate, of stolen land of the indigenous, of genocide of the indigenous, of chattel slavery of African bodies and minds and souls, and of course, the wage slavery of the working class. The seas of decay and chaos has been sold by the capitalist rule in the United States and around the world. The only way that we can uproot these seeds of destruction by the capitalists, by capitalist exploitation, by poverty, by endless war, by environmental decay and racial oppression, is that the working class, the poor and the oppressed, will have to forge a new world based on solidarity, based on cooperation, based on social struggle, and workers' democracy in the development of a socialist world. It is possible. The question is, are we prepared to fight for it?